in it was to appeal to those people who were wavering, if you like, between Rory's position and ours. And that's what won us the vote.
Having aligned himself with the Adams leadership and the majority, Cahill watched some of his oldest comrades walk out of the Ardèche. In their eyes, he was a traitor.
Well, of course, it was another card in their hand, and they played it and played it well. One is tempted to say, well, why didn't they go with the officials at the time if that's the way they were going to end up? Why go through all this struggle and sacrifice?
It was really quite a dramatic picture if you think about it, because here was Joe Cahill, who had joined the Provos, and one of the leading members joining the Provos in 1970, helped to form the organization, helped to create it in Belfast in particular. Left in circumstances in which the cries of political treachery could be heard all over the city, directed at the Cahill-Golding leadership. And here he is, a matter of 15 or 16 years later, saying, well, what Golding did, we're not going to do. We're not going to abandon militarism, but he's actually going down exactly the same road. And as Golding, he will end up going down the constitutional road into parliamentarism. The guns will go away, just in exactly the same way it happened with the officials. And they're on exactly the same journey. So I think it's a huge irony here in relation to his character. They, in a matter of 15 or 16 years, you see the circle turn the full 360 degrees.
The key thing to remember about the 1986 split is that almost all of Belfast stayed, sort of with the Provos. The leadership people who went with Rory O'Brady mainly came from the south and the west, and I think that reflected the fact that republicanism in Southern Ireland was always more ideological than it was in the north, and in the north it was sometimes a matter of survival. 1986 really was the moment, sort of when the provisionals decided that a lot of the old shibboleths, about 1916 and the democratic mandate coming from the men on the steps of the GPO, that was really a lot of old nonsense, so they weren't going to put it like that. 1986, of course, terrifically important in relation to the peace process and the ceasefires which came, only 8 years later. Came the first IRA ceasefire, and I think that was part of a process of the provisional IRA and the Republican movement generally bringing itself into alignment with the consciousness of the people that it purported to represent.
Although the movement continued to pursue the policy of the Armalite and the ballot box, the IRA's violence proved seriously damaging to Sinn Féin's electoral ambitions. Joe Cahill became a potent symbol for the Adams leadership. After 50 years of armed struggle, he was now endorsing the peace process, and not just on the streets of West Belfast.
In the whole debate we were having about developing what became known as the peace process, we decided that there had to be an international dimension to all of that. We wanted the involvement of Irish American, and Joe had been somebody that in various times had gone to America and had related to them, and it was crucial that the support base that we had in America in terms of Irish Americans heard at first hand what was happening.
Well, Joe was chosen quite deliberately, and Joe understood why he was chosen. He was chosen because he was hugely respected in the United States, and that our cause, if you like, in building the peace process would have been detrimentally served by any refusal of the US administration to grant them a visa.
This would not be Cahill's first brush with US immigration authorities. In 1984, he was deported for IRA membership and barred from entering the country. Now, 10 years after that event, he was the subject of nervous diplomatic debate in the White House.
Clinton,
one of his first questions was, you know, have you read his CV? And I said, no, I didn't have to. Everybody in Ireland, and I don't know, far abroad, would know the name of Joe Cahill over the years, you know, as an IRA leader. The Department of Justice, the State Department, the Attorney General, you name it, I don't think there was anybody left out. All had told him in no uncertain terms that there was no way he could breach the immigration laws, especially with somebody who was so objectionable.
Despite the objections, President Clinton granted the visa. What wasn't publicly known was that the previous week the IRA's Army Council had voted for a ceasefire, and now it was Joe Cahill's job as a traditional Belfast IRA man to sell the new strategy to Irish America. It was also important to Sinn Féin that he be welcomed as a VIP.
Well, he represented a continuous struggle that was now saying that there is another development in the struggle that became known as the peace process. He was saying all that against the background of what they knew he was and his own history. And that this was a new era, but the objectives remained the same.
Joe was, you know, absolutely of a view that if we could bring about a set of political circumstances that would see an end to conflict in our country, see an end to all of the inequalities and discriminations and injustices, that we should head for the political road.
It appeared that Clinton's gamble had paid off. After decades of armed conflict with Britain, the IRA had agreed to lay down its arms. On the 31st of August 1994, 48 hours after Cahill landed in the United States, the IRA leadership declared its ceasefire.
It's just been announced that from midnight tonight, the leadership of the IRA have decided that it will be a complete cessation of military operations.
The ceasefire and the Good Friday Agreement that followed marked the end of Joe Cahill's active political life, but the old gunman's support for the peace process remained vital to Sinn Féin.
Can I say, first of all, that not all of the Sinn Féin leadership is here today. Reprobates like Tom Hartley and Jim Givney and Lucy de Breathnach send their best greetings, and Joe Cahill sends a big hi from New York.
He was very supportive of it. You know, I think he had come to the realization, along with others, that militarily they weren't going to win. I probably didn't realize at the time how an important figure he was.
We have won the war. Let us win the peace.
I think I heard somebody saying there wouldn't have been a peace process without Joe Cahill, you know, and you know, that realization only came later on as to how big a part he did play.
He was a man who was trusted. He was a man who had risked his life and his liberty in defence of his people, and he was a much loved figure. And I think he will always have a huge place within the hearts and minds of Irish Republicans and all those who have helped us build Sinn Féin to the political strength that we have at the moment.
It's undoubtedly true that it was easier to sell the new Republican peace process strategy to some of the supporters because people like Joe Cahill were on board and were on side. It's also true that if there would be no peace process without Joe Cahill, you could equally say there would have been a very different kind of war process as well in the earlier period. And if he's going to be given credit, as perhaps he should, for endorsing a new kind of politics in the 1990s, you could also say that he has to take a share of responsibility for endorsing the new kind of violence that they engaged in such awful levels, at such awful levels in the early 1970s.
Joe Cahill inhabited the murky world of criminality, the American mafia, links with Gaddafi people who had their own reasons for disliking the United Kingdom. The fact that he was bringing in the weapons at all led to levels of violence which will not be forgotten in my lifetime.
Please try to understand that yesterday's terrorist is today's politician and tomorrow's leader. It's very, very difficult for someone who was a detective for 26 years and went to hundreds of murders and saw people blown to pieces and saw children decapitated and with no arms and legs. Very, very difficult for police officers to accept that the people responsible for that and the people that give moral or give sanction to that feel that morally they're entitled now to speak on behalf of hundreds of thousands of people. All right, they might have a political mandate, but it seems very convenient that they forget all the dreadful things they've done.
Joe Cahill died on the 23rd of July 2004. His was one of the largest funerals ever seen in West Belfast. Republican leaders compared him to Wolfton, Emmett and Pearse. Others are unable to forgive him for his pivotal role in the North's violence. Either way, he embodies a half-century of nationalist Irish struggle, with all the unity and the division, the fierce loyalty and the bitter loss that the struggle has entailed.
Without doubt, there would not be a peace process without Joe Cahill. And he had no illusions about the business of building peace. Peace requires justice, because peace is more than the absence of conflict.
I wasn't close to Joe Cahill personally, but I did have a drink with him 3 or 4 occasions down through the years and been in his company. It would not be my impression that Joe Cahill would have seen himself as being sort of in the tradition of Emmett, Tone and these people. I think that he always came across to me as a man sort of a rather humbler view of himself and rather humbler outlook in life. I suppose that people wanted to talk him up. I rather think that Joe Cahill would have been embarrassed by some of the eulogies which followed his death. I suppose he's not alone in that in Irish political history.